Welcome to part 2 of my High Elf race guide. In this section we'll be going over the High Elf roster and how I believe every unit is best used in battle, as well as my recommended army compositions. Disclaimer, this guide is based on my personal experiences and opinions and is by no means a definitive way to play the High Elves in Mortal Empires. If you have a different strategy and want to add something to mine, please leave a comment down below. Now that's out of the way, let's get into the video. The High Elves army is based on quality over quantity, so units may cost more than they do in other factions, but they'll pull their weight accordingly. They also benefit from being at full health due to martial prowess, which gives them bonuses upon entering battle at full health. Overall they are fairly balanced in battle, with a good number of powerful ranged and melee units, and a couple of monsters to keep things interesting. First up to the plate is Spearmen, and as starting units go, they're actually not too bad. They're shielded, so can ignore a lot of ranged punishments. They're also anti-large and have a charged defense against large foes, so should have no problem going up against any early game cavalry or other large units. Don't send them off chasing cavalry though, as they obviously don't have the speed to catch up to horses. In the early game I'd recommend about 4 or 5 of those to hold the front lines while being backed up by some ranged units. Once better infantry are unlocked, then cut down to just 2 to cover your flanks and focus down nearly large targets. Next are the White Lions of Krace, and already things are getting interesting. They're armoured but not shielded, so while they can shrug off most forms of damage, they are vulnerable to gradual damage from skirmishing. They also deal armour-piercing damage, so will cut through tough melee troops like butter. They are also equipped with the Lion's Cloaks, which, other than being very fashionable, provide them with protection against regular and magical missiles. This balances out the lack of shields and allows them to take more range punishment while being locked in melee. They also have the Forest Strider attribute, which allows them to perform better in melee when fighting in forests. I'd recommend 2 or 3 of these guys in early to mid-game army, whilst being supported by some spears and ranged units to cover your bases. Swordmasters of Hearth are, in my opinion, some of the best, if not the best, melee troops in the game. They're armoured, so can take a lot of punishment from non-armour piercing units. They also deal armour piercing damage themselves, so will be able to take out even the toughest targets. They're also an anti-infantry unit, so get a bonus when fighting against small melee troops, which makes them machines at taking out entire units of enemy infantry. They also have the ability to deflect shots. Yes, you heard me right, these guys are so baller that they can see an arrow coming towards them and yeet that bitch back to whoever sent it. Unfortunately they don't have shields, so if they miss the deflector or are locked in melee and can't defend themselves, they are vulnerable to range attacks from all sources. Generally in battle I send them against any other infantry and they'll either come out on top or take a hell of a lot of units down with them. Like, these guys can get an unreal number of kills, it's not even funny. I'd recommend replacing your white line troops with these guys as soon as you can, as there's nothing they can't do better in my opinion. The Phoenix Guard are up next, and they're the giant killers of the High Elf ranks. They're a halberd unit, so deal bonus damage to anything larger than a man, and also have charge defense against all units. They are heavily armoured, so can take a huge amount of punishment from non-armour piercing units, and they also deal armour piercing damage themselves. As with most anti-large units, I'd recommend 2 of these guys in your late game armies to defend your flanks and keep you protected from any cavalry or monster charges. They aren't shielded, so it's best to get them into melee as soon as you can to make sure they spend their health well and take plenty down with them. Exclusive to Athaloran are the Dryads, which are technically a Wood Elf unit. Since I played as Lorthan, I didn't get much experience with them, but from what I can tell they're actually pretty good for an early game monstrous melee unit. They have the Forest Spirit attribute, so can shrug off most forms of non-magical damage and take a bunch of punishment in battle. They're a damage dealer unit, so you want to get them into melee as soon as you can, but choose your targets carefully as they aren't effective against armour. Finally, they also have Vanguard deployment, so can be placed as close to the enemy lines as possible to get straight into the fight, or be placed strategically to flank from an unexpected location. I'd recommend 1 or 2 of them in an early game army to focus down weak troops and psych out the enemy, as they also cause fear and make enemies lose leadership quicker. Archers are opening for the High Elf ranged infantry, and as early game range goes, they're pretty top tier. They have fantastic range, so can get plenty of shots off an enemies before they even get near to you, but they aren't brilliant against armour, so will lose effectiveness soon into the mid game. They do need to be defended from melee attacks, so keeping them behind the front line is very necessary until they're locked in combat. Once the front line is established, they can be used to flank around and shoot in the back of the enemy lines to avoid friendly fire. I'd recommend bringing as many archers as you do melee units in an early game army to keep things perfectly balanced, as all things should be. They come in 2 variations, regular and light armour. The light armoured versions obviously have more armour and slightly higher melee defense, but you still shouldn't let them get locked in melee. Lorthan Sea Guard are up next, and they're a hybrid weapons unit. They're equipped with bows but have a little less range and damage than regular archers, but this is balanced by their ability to fight fairly well in melee. They also have spears, so have all the advantages that come like that, like bonus against large targets and charge defense against them. All this makes them a great all-round unit, and your mid-game armies can be comprised only of them if you want. If I'm doing that, I personally like to have 2 lines of them, so that half units can stay in range mode while the other half get into melee. If I can, I also swap them out once ammo has been spent. You also have to be sure to disable skirmish mode to stop units from running away once the enemies get near. They also come in 2 variations, with them without shields. Shields give them better stats in melee defense and allow them to be more protected from range attacks at the cost of being slightly slower. Gate Guards are a weird one. They're only available within the gates of Wrath Garrison, so you can't take them around your armies. Nevertheless, they are a pretty well-rounded unit. They're kind of like Northern Sea Guard that more protects gates than the sea. They're anti-large and have charge defense against them, so you don't have to worry about them being too vulnerable to cavalry charges. They also have good range, so you can get plenty of skirmishing done before the enemies even get close to the walls. The way to use them is pretty straightforward, and as far as composition goes, you have no f***ing choice. Shadow Warriors, despite their dorky-ass name, are actually pretty cool. They have good range, so they're great for picking off early kills in the battle. They also have Vanguard deployment, so can attack the enemy right out the gate or from an unexpected location. Once the front lines are established, they also stalk and have master ambushes, so can move hidden through all terrain and attack whilst moving. I use them to replace the second line of Sea Guard in my mid-game armies, as the better range and utility is worth losing out on the extra melee troops. In a balanced army, this equates to 4 units. Shadow Walkers are a unit exclusive to Nagarythe. They're basically a better version of Shadow Warriors. They have all the same attributes with the addition of having poison attacks, which will debuff enemy troops who get hit. I think swapping 2 warriors for walkers makes for a good balance of armor piercing damage and poison damage, as poison tends to deal less damage overall. Again, as I played as Lorvan, I didn't really have much experience with these guys, but I think they could be really great in a mid-game or even late-game army. Closing the range units are the Sisters of Athaloran, and they are god tier. They have armor piercing missiles, so can pick away even the toughest units and deal good damage. They have great range, so can get a huge amount of damage in before your enemies even get close to you. They're equipped with the Bows of Athaloran, which fires missiles of mystical blue fire, which basically means they set enemies ablaze and pierce armor like it's nothing. Top off, they're also decent melee combatants, so even if the enemy makes it through your front lines, they'll be able to hold their own against some weaker troops. I'd recommend 4 of them to place behind your front lines, and as usual, if you can get a flanking angle, then do it, as it'll cut down on friendly fire by a mile. Kicking off the cavalry are the Illyrian Reavers, and they're pretty standard as far as early game cav go. They're very fast, so can get around enemy infantry pretty easily and either charge melee in the back or target range units while they're undefended. They also have Vanguard deployment, so can get close to and around the enemy right from the start. In battle, I like to target weaker ranged units, as I said before, but I also like to cycle charge into the backs of the enemy front lines to break their morale. I recommend bringing 2 of them in an early game army, to keep the micromanagement to a level you can deal with. Silver Helms and X-Knight play pretty much the same but with slightly different stats. They're armoured, which comes at the cost of speed while being able to take more punishment. They're also an anti-infantry unit, so getting bonus when sent against infantry, so targeting units of men is essential for getting your money's worth. The strategy is pretty much the same as Reavers, as you want to flank around the undefended range units and crush the front lines morale with cycle charges. Again, I would recommend a couple of these guys in your mid-game arms to keep the micro to an acceptable level. They come in 2 variations, with and without shields. As usual, shields provide a boost in range and melee defense at the cost of extra gold and minor stat differences. The final unit of melee cavalry are the Dragon Princes, and if you haven't heard of them already, then you clearly haven't played enough Warhammer 2. They're armoured and shielded, so can take a ridiculous amount of punishment in battle, and even can be left in melee with some weaker infantry units. Their armour is also unique to them, as it is dragon armour, which grants them immunity to fire damage as it was forged inside a volcano. Cool. They also have the trait of Martial Mastery, which is much like the racial trait Martial Prowess, meaning that when they go to battle at full health, they receive bonuses. Once they become heavily damaged, they lose a lot of effectiveness, so it's best to keep them out of harm's way for as long as you can. You want to employ the usual strategy here to get the most out of them, but I've already said it twice for the other units, so I'm not going to say it again, but you get the idea. Opening and closing for the Missile Cavalry are the Illyrian Reaver Archers. They're similar to regular Reavers stats-wise, but swap the Lancers for bows, so are excellent skirmishers. They have great speed, so can keep out of range of melee troops, and can also fire whilst moving, so are excellent for running units around whilst chipping away at them. They also come with Vanguard deployment, so can get into the enemy's face with a hail of arrows right from the start. Their strategy is fairly straightforward with these guys. Pick away exposed flanks whilst avoiding getting into melee for as long as you can, as they won't last very long. I recommend 2 of these guys in an early game army, and that should fill their role nicely. The High Elves only have access to 1 chariot, the Ithilmar chariot. They're armoured, so are much better at being left in melee than regular cavalry of the same tier. They're also anti-infantry, so are best used for targeting units of infantry that are either low morale or already locked in combat. This will ensure that they run and not come back or die trying. They lack the charging capability of regular cavalry, but as I said earlier, they make up for this with better durability and survivability in melee. I prefer to bring 2 of these guys over any early game cav, as I prefer the less micro-based gameplay, so I can give the other parts of the battle my attention, but the choice is yours on what you can handle better. The Tyrannoc Chariot is the only ranged chariot unit they have access to, but it's pretty cool nonetheless. They're an anti-infantry unit, so perform best when attacking infantry units from a distance, and keeping distance should be no trouble as they have good speed and can fire whilst moving. This means they can run the enemy around whilst keeping the range pressure up. They're also equipped with Reaver bows which fire 3 arrows at once, so even though the unit number is smaller than Reavers, they make up for it in firepower per unit. I recommend bringing 2 of these units to replace any Reaver archers you have, as the extra damage and bonuses to armour and defence make them a better overall unit. Onto the Monsters and Beasts now, starting with the Great Eagle, which is the most basic of the 3 smaller flyers. It only has the trait very fast, so it is useful for getting in to attack exposed artillery and getting out before reinforcements arrive. If there are no ranged units to attack, then they can be used well for attacking the back of the enemy front lines. Just take care not to let them get overwhelmed, as they won't last long if unspotted. I recommend one of these as soon as you unlock them to give you some early air superiority. Next is the Flame Spy Phoenix. That's an armor-piercing unit that can be used to swoop into the front lines to focus down tough targets, but be aware that it isn't the most protected unit itself. To balance out its weaker defense, it has the Rebirth ability, which gives it chance of regaining health when death is imminent, allowing it to carry on fighting a little bit longer. They're also attuned to magic, which means that their magical attacks become stronger when the winds of magic are, quote, in full gale, whatever that means. What this actually means is that when the winds of magic capacity is above 50%, they do more damage, so bear this in mind when putting them on the field with expensive spellcasters. Finally, they have a special attack they can use from above called Wake of Fire, which causes explosive fire damage under wherever they are at the time. This can be used in a variety of ways to maximise damage as the cooldown is so short, but is definitely worth using in the fight before getting locked in melee. I bring either one of these or one of the frost darts into my armies until the end, as they're a little bit faster than the dragons and offer different buffs, so are worth the slot. Finally is the Frost Dart Phoenix, which is very similar to the Flame Spirit in almost every way. It trades the Rebirth and Wake of Fire abilities for a tougher armor stat, which makes it better suited for prolonged melee rather than flank support. It also has a magical aura which debuffs enemy melee attack and armor piercing damage in a radius around itself, making it again very effective in the front line supporting your melee troops. As I said, I take either one of these or a Flame Spirit into my late game armies. Onto the dragons, and all of you guys are so similar in how they're used, I'm just going to explain it once at the end. The Sun Dragon is first up, and is pretty top tier for when in the game you can use it. It has a Sun Dragon's Breath ability, which is a widespread breath ability which will cause major damage to big clumps of infantry, provided they aren't too armoured. This can rack up insane numbers of kills per use, so make sure you use all your charger you can in battle. They deal armour piercing damage in melee, so once they get into that, they can take on some pretty tough units. They also cause terror, so will quickly cause enemy units to flee as soon as they get near, and drain the leadership of any that remain. Finally, they have Scaly Skin, which dampens and even deflects missiles dealt to them. I'm not sure if this allows them to send the damage back, but either way it's a great trait to have for such a large unit. The only real difference the Moon Dragon brings is its breath ability. The Moon Breath is more focused and better for taking out larger enemies with a powerful explosion, and is again worth using all of your charges so you get the most kills you can. They're also slightly better stats wise in leadership, melee defense and weapon damage, whilst having slightly worse charge. Both are great options for your armies, and it really comes down to which you prefer in battle, but in my opinion, Star Dragon is best. Its breath ability is good against pretty much everything, no matter if it's large, armoured or fast. It will just melt everything. It also has the armoured trait, so it can take a bit more punishment than the other two, meaning that once you've got into melee, it's not going anywhere for quite a while. For all these units, I'd recommend using your breath charges before going into melee, and when you're choosing your melee targets, try to avoid anything anti-large just to help them survive a bit longer. You should also be sure not to let them get overwhelmed, as they'll quickly die if they are the focus. I recommend any one of these guys in your late game armies, as they are just killing machines. The last two units are again exclusives to Athaloran. The Treekin are first, and they are a Wood Elf unit. They have the Forest Spirit trait, which, as I said before, gives them resistance to most damage that isn't magical, so they can take quite a bit of punishment in battle. They're also armoured, so are extremely tough to take down, as well as having a charge defense against large foes, meaning cavalry charges won't hit them too hard. I recommend using them to focus on less armoured targets in their front lines to cause a bit of chaos to formations with their large AoE attacks. A couple in a mid to late game army could replace cavalry as a less micro based option, but they are fairly limited in their use, so I'll let you be the judge. Closing out the high elf monsters is the Tree Man. He also has the Forest Spirit trait and is armoured, so he'll be around for a long time before he needs to retreat. He also deals armour piercing damage, so can take out even the toughest enemies in melee with relative ease, and to top it off, he has charge defense against all, so nothing will throw him off balance. Unfortunately, being so big means that they are magnets for range attacks, and will slowly be chipped away over the course of the battle. Their best use in the front line is focusing down tough targets and ruining formations with huge AoE attacks. I'd say bringing one of them in a late game army will make a real difference in taking on almost anyone. Finally, we come to the last unit and my favourite category. The Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower is the only artillery unit available to the High Elves, but there's something special about it. You can choose its ammo. There's two modes to choose from. The first is a simple bolt that is better for larger or more armoured targets such as lords and heroes. The second is a multi-shot, which is better for taking out large clumps of infantry with a less piercing but more balanced shot. It's best to choose your armour per target to get the most out of this unit, and if done correctly you can rack up an ungodly number of kills with it. I take two with me in my armies until the end, as the high range and damage make them well worth the slots. At last we come to the Regiments of Renown, and I'm going to go into a little more detail than usual to give you a better idea of what the differences are. Firstly are the Scions of Mathlan, which are a spearman unit. They are given a magical aura which grants plus 12 damage resist to themselves and units around them. They also have better leadership and melee attack and defense. The Pure Main Company are a White Lines of Crace unit, and also get a magical aura, but theirs grants plus 15% physical resistance. They also have Sundered Armour attacks, which gives the unit they're attacking minus 30 armour for 10 seconds on hit. And finally, they have the same stat improvements as Scions. The Keepers of the Flame are a Phoenix Guard unit, and are equipped with the Mask of Azurian. This means that when they're killed, their killer is, quote, engulfed in Azurian's flames. Once again, they have the same stat improvements, and also gain magical attacks. The Storm Riders are a Lord Sea Guard unit, and are granted Vanguard deployment, the ability to fire whilst moving, the regular stat improvements with an additional buff to missile damage, and also the ability to cause fear. The Grey are a Shadow Warriors unit that are given the Snipe trait, which allows them to remain hidden whilst firing. They also have the ability Loex Shroud, which grants them plus 24% speed, stalk, and they become unspottable. Finally, they also get the same stat buffs as Storm Riders. The Everqueen's Court Guard are a set of Athalorian units, and they give a leadership bonus to any units near them, and improve power recharge rates and the same stat buffs as the other range units. The Fireborn are a Dragon Prince unit and are granted several traits. They become anti-large units, and they also now have flaming attacks as well as the usual buffs. Finally, we have the Heralds of the Wind, which are an Illyrian Reaver bow unit. They are now decent melee commanders as well as getting buffs in nearly every category, as you can see. That concludes this section of the guide on the High Elf armies. In the next section we will cover the Lords and Heroes and what they can do for you both in campaign and on the battlefield. Thanks for watching this section of my High Elf race guide. If you want to check out the other parts, there's a link in the card and in the description for a playlist of the series. Don't forget to vote on the poll for the next race you want me to make a guide for, which is linked in the description and the comments. If you enjoyed this video at any point, please consider leaving it a like as it really does help out a lot, and if you want to see more of this type of video, maybe click that subscribe button to stay up to date. After all, it is free. For now though, I was COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I'll see you next turn.